Hello, and welcome to the Coach Right podcast, where we explore how to turn coaching expertise into published pages. I'm your host, Helen ONeill, portfolio career specialist, author, and creator of Coach Right, the writing space and program specifically designed for coaches. You can get the episode show notes and your free guide to publishing options at coachright.co.uk. It's time for the next chapter. Welcome to the Coach Right podcast. I'm your host, Helen ONeill, and this is episode 31. Today we have an episode of the footnotes, and it's a topic close to many of our hearts: how to make our books more accessible. Inclusivity is woven into coaching. The EMCC uses the word specifically as one of its values. The ICF uses the term respect to capture it. And for most of us, being inclusive is part of our desire to serve. So we know it's important, and as coaches, we know how powerful words can be. But sometimes what's more difficult is putting that into practice. I spoke about this with Hayley in episode 30. There is often a lot of terminology which can evolve over time. It can be intimidating. None of us want to say the wrong thing. So first, let's have a quick recap of what inclusivity actually is. We hear the acronym, don't we? DEIB, all the time. D for diversity, where we recognise and value the differences amongst people. Some of those characteristics are protected by law, others are not. Then we have E for equity. This is where we ensure everybody is treated fairly and has equal opportunities based on their needs. Inclusion is about creating environments where individuals and groups feel welcome, respected, and valued, and belonging as we seek to consider the emotional aspect of inclusion. So, that's great from a terminology perspective, but what does that mean for us in terms of writers? Well, we can think about it in terms of what we write, how we write, and the publishing choices that we make. And I'm going to start with the how. There is a wonderful book called The Conscious Style Guide by Karen Yin, and I'll link that in the show notes. She talks about conscious language, saying it's about being aware, mindful, and intentional with the words that we choose. This isn't about political correctness for the sake of it. It's intentionality. I won't paraphrase the whole book, but she talks about 5 elements to consider when we're looking to write more consciously. So first of all, we have content. This is anything and everything that goes on that blank page. It's the sum of the parts, both in terms of the goal behind the content and elements such as tone of voice, linguistic markers, things like use of accent, and even the power dynamic that's being conveyed. We choose a style for our words which can include or exclude. And this isn't always a bad thing if we're considering this consciously in terms of the audience that we're trying to reach. So, for example, you would make different choices when you were writing for a child than you would when you were writing for an adult. Then we have context. This enables us to consider how language will be perceived. It's a constellation of factors, all of which influence the interpretation of a word or words. The word cool could mean that something is brilliant or literally cold, depending on the context. And that context could come from us as the writer and our lived experience, or the reader and theirs. It can also depend on the mechanism for delivering the writing. A social post versus an article. They might contain the same content, but convey the context in a very different way. Words have the ability to make us think. They are powerful. They can shift our perception and they can impose conclusions. There are intentional consequences and unintentional ones, such as microaggressions or implicit bias. Words can limit or liberate. Considering consequence is about respect. So instead of saying mankind, we might say humanity, for example. Complexity, as the word suggests, is where it all starts to get a bit tricky, because words aren't one size fits all. Identity shift. Is someone a survivor or a victim of a crime? It might depend on the circumstance, the crime, and where they are personally in their healing journey. There's a whole range of complexity where there's intersectionality. And the point here isn't to try and tick all the boxes, but rather to be mindful of and to highlight complexity wherever possible. And then lastly, there's compassion. This is the compass that guides you to use language in a positive way. Language of the past doesn't always read so well to the modern ear. We can recognise that and comment on it appropriately. It helps language evolve in a positive way. Next, let's consider what we write. We spend a lot of time working through this in Coach Write 90 because no matter how much you might resist the idea, you aren't writing a book for everyone. It's a bit like when you start your coaching practice and you choose a niche. Some of us feel quite resistant to that, but once you do, you realise that building your business is much easier. And it certainly doesn't mean that you won't or can't coach anyone else. It just means that you connect specifically with one person. And the same is true for writing. We write to help a reader solve a problem and make a transformation. They start in one place and move through the book to another. The more specific you can be, the better. I quite like to write a letter to my reader before I start a new book. It helps me to connect with them and the issue that they're experiencing. It helps me really understand where they're stuck, what they want, and how what I'm going to write can genuinely help them. Now, the book itself, of course, once it's there, it can be read widely, but it's written for one person. And there's a lovely saying that brings this to life. If you try to write for everyone, you write for no one. Then we have the publishing choices we make. These days, there is a lot of cost-effective technology that supports us in enabling readers to access our words. If you're traditionally publishing, these choices might not be yours to make. So if they're important to you, it's worth having that conversation at the contract stage. If you're independently publishing, consider how to build these things into your publishing roadmap. Visual accessibility is often the first one that comes to mind. Digital publishing is great here. Make sure your book is available as an EPUB file. This is how your books get onto your Kindle or your Kobo device. And once it's there, readers can adjust the settings to read the book in a way that's easier for them. And if you're using images, alt text is a simple thing to do that gets constantly skipped. Make the time to describe an image for somebody using a screen reader. For print, the words are fixed once they're printed. So it's worth thinking about things like larger print options. Honestly, who wants to read teeny tiny words anyway? But also think about things like colour contrast for low vision readers, for example, which can also be important for those with cognitive or neurological access needs. For readers with dyslexia, for example, a sans serif font, something like Arial or Verdana, is much easier to read than a traditional font like Times New Roman. Formatting is important too. Headings, subheadings, decent spacing between lines, left aligned rather than justified. Traditionally, fiction is printed on cream paper, while non-fiction is printed on white. However, that is a convention, not a rule, and the high contrast of black writing on white paper is easier to read for many. And try to have as many publication options as possible. An ebook, a paperback, a hardcover. Each will suit different readers in different ways and aren't difficult or expensive to produce. And then, of course, we have audio. Audiobooks are growing, particularly for non-fiction, because people like to listen while they're doing something else. It used to be an incredibly expensive format to produce, often somewhere between £2,000 and £10,000. AI is changing all of that. Whether it be AI narration or assisted production tools, the format is less price prohibitive to produce and a wonderful option for accessibility. Ultimately, whatever we write, we do it for connection. That might be connection with that ideal reader. It might be a connection with a community or a connection with your own creativity. As practitioners, our respect for our readers and our willingness to learn are all steps on our path to welcoming people with our writing. And being an inclusive writer and publisher doesn't come with a checklist. Write for the person you're trying to help and leave the door open for anyone else who might choose to step through. Select your words from a place of kindness and respect, and make your publishing choices so that those words are as accessible as possible. And together, we can all become more inclusive writers. A little while ago, I committed to bringing you interviews with author service providers who might be useful to your writing and publishing journey. And I am delighted to say that next week we have the first of those episodes, where I'll be joined by Martin Kavanagh from Readsy. Readsy are a marketplace of freelancers who support authors with things like editing, cover design, and much more. And Martin is their head of content. So we will talk about Readsy in more detail and the services that they offer, but we also put the world to rights with all things writing and publishing. I hope you found today's episode useful. I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment where you're listening, and I will see you for the next chapter. Thank you for joining me today. You can get the show notes and your free guide to publishing options at coachwrite.co.uk. Remember to subscribe and leave a review on your podcatcher of choice. Your words can make a difference. A review can too. If you'd like to connect, find me on LinkedIn, ONeill Helen, that's ONeill, ONeill, or on Instagram at coach_write. I'll see you for the next chapter.